In the winter of 1847, Latoya, a young woman in her early 20s, was admitted to the Blessed Mercy Infirmary in Millbrook, Massachusetts, a Protestant hospital run by ministers. Her mysterious case would haunt the institution, leading to the destruction of most records, except for one doctor's personal journal. The details in this journal defied medical understanding, challenging the beliefs of the time. Local church leaders pushed for the case to be sealed, and within 6 months, 3 of the doctors involved left medicine altogether. Latoya's story has remained untold until now. The Blessed Mercy Infirmary, established in 1834 by Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore, was at the center of a town divided by tensions between the old Congregationalist families and Irish Catholic immigrants. With 20 beds, it was the largest medical facility in the region. The staff of 7 physicians, all Harvard-trained Protestants, balanced scientific practice with Christian compassion. Dr. Jonathan Aldridge, the hospital's chief physician, prided himself on combining the latest medical knowledge with a deep faith in divine providence. Latoya's case began when she was found unconscious in a barn by a farmer. She had no memory of how she arrived there, carrying only a leather pouch with 7 silver coins and a brass locket. Despite her ordeal, she was in excellent physical condition, but her behavior was unsettling. She spoke with an eerie precision and displayed a strange awareness of her surroundings. When asked about her background, Latoya's response was chilling. Latoya, nothing more. Please give me a like and subscribe so I can be motivated to create more great videos. Her most puzzling behavior surfaced when she spoke in a language that no one could identify. Dr. Aldridge's colleague, Dr. Marcus Brennan, a linguist, noted it was a mix of several languages, possibly African or Caribbean dialects. Latoya, however, insisted she only spoke English. The hospital's staff began reporting disturbing occurrences. Latoya seemed to predict events before they happened, and patients reported strange dreams where she spoke of things she couldn't have known. One patient, Mrs. Zelina Hitchcock, claimed Latoya had described the death of her husband in detail, though Latoya had never met her. Dr. Aldridge, initially skeptical, witnessed an event that made him question his beliefs. On January 18th, he observed Latoya speaking in the unknown language again. As she spoke, patients in nearby beds began to stir restlessly, and one Thomas Brewster experienced vivid visions of a tropical landscape followed by an inexplicable emotional breakdown. Strange phenomena continued. The hospital's temperature stabilized, and the usual rat infestation disappeared when Latoya was calm. Reverend Whitmore, who visited the hospital, frequently grew disturbed after a private meeting with her, suggesting that she possessed knowledge no Christian soul should have. Dr. Aldridge documented his confusion, torn between his scientific training and what he observed. Meanwhile, Dr. Brennan uncovered a chilling discovery: a shipwrecked slave ship. The Esperanza had a survivor named Latoya, who was described as speaking in unknown tongues and possessing extraordinary healing knowledge. This Latoya was only 4 years old at the time. The mystery surrounding Latoya's presence at the Blessed Mercy Infirmary led to strange occurrences that defied logic and medicine. The case would go on to haunt everyone involved, leaving questions unanswered for over a century. According to records, Latoya had been placed with a Presbyterian family in Peabody, but 3 years later, she disappeared, leaving behind a note written in the same incomprehensible language that Dr. Brennan had heard her speak. Dr. Brennan noted in private correspondence, "If this is indeed the same woman, now 28, she appears no older than 22. How could someone raised by a strict Christian family acquire knowledge of African spiritual practices?" Dr. Aldridge initially dismissed the theory, but when he mentioned the slave ship records to Latoya, her response was immediate. She began speaking rapidly in the unknown language, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her brass locket. For the first time, she spoke of her past fragments of memories: a ship in violent seas, the smell of death, and voices in languages she couldn't name. She remembered running into the woods, living with those who knew the old ways. "I don't age as others do," she whispered. "Time moves differently for those who carry the weight of generations." Dr. Aldridge, a man of science, tried to rationalize her experiences considering dissociative disorder or childhood trauma. But her knowledge of historical events, ability to predict occurrences, and profound effect on others suggested something more. The hospital staff split into two camps, those who viewed her as a fascinating medical case, and those who believed she brought an unholy presence into their Christian institution. Sister Mary Catherine, despite her Catholic faith, confessed to Dr. Aldridge, "What I observe feels ancient primal, connected to forces older than Christ. It's not evil, but it's not wholly good either." Tension grew when Mrs. Hitchcock, the pneumonia patient who claimed Latoya spoke of her deceased husband, requested to be moved next to Latoya. She explained that Latoya's presence brought vivid memories of her late husband, his laughter, his songs, and their wedding day. The move led to other patients requesting similar arrangements, citing improvements in their conditions and a newfound sense of peace. But not everyone had positive reactions. Jacob Morrison, a merchant recovering from dysentery, became disturbed by Latoya's presence. His nightmares of violent suffering and guilt from actions he never took worsened his condition. He told Dr. Aldridge, "I see things in my dreams that I know I've never witnessed, but they feel like memories. I can't escape the guilt of actions I never took." As reactions polarized, the hospital became tense. Staff avoided Latoya's wing during off hours, while others lingered near her room. Dr. Aldridge noticed that younger staff seemed less affected by her presence, while older employees, especially those with strong religious convictions, showed increasing anxiety. The situation became more complicated when Reverend Whitmore returned to the hospital, accompanied by two other ministers, Reverend Isaiah Blackwood and Reverend Cornelius Marsh. They requested a private meeting with Dr. Aldridge to express their grave concerns about Latoya. "We believe your patient may be engaging in harmful worship practices," Reverend Whitmore whispered. Family members of patients claim their loved ones have had visions and dreams that don't align with Christian teachings. Dr. Aldridge found himself torn between his medical duties and the religious authority funding his hospital. The minister's concerns were not unfounded. He had witnessed changes in patients that defied medical explanation, though Latoya showed no malice or intention to harm. She seemed as confused by the effects of her presence as everyone else. The meeting concluded with an agreement allowing the ministers to observe Latoya's interactions while Dr. Aldridge continued his medical evaluation. Neither party anticipated how this would lead to revelations challenging both scientific and religious beliefs. On February 1st, 1847, the observation period began, and what followed would change their understanding of Latoya's case. Reverend Blackwood, with his focus on personal spiritual experience, was the first to notice synchronicities in Latoya's behavior. She would begin speaking in the unknown language when patients were in emotional distress, as if she could sense their pain. Surprisingly, her words seemed to calm those who couldn't understand them. "I have never witnessed such spiritual empathy," Reverend Blackwood confessed. "She seems to absorb and transform the suffering of others." Dr. Aldridge, intrigued by these abilities, set up controlled tests. With Latoya's consent, he arranged for her to meet patients while observing from behind a screen. The results were astonishing. During one session, she met Mr. Jeremiah Couch, a 70-year-old farmer suffering from a persistent cough. After meeting Latoya, Mr. Couch began speaking about his experiences during the War of 1812, something he had never shared before. As he spoke, his cough began to subside. "It was as if she drew the poison from my lungs," Mr. Couch later told Dr. Aldridge. But it wasn't just the sickness. It was the memories of lost friends in the war. Speaking them aloud made it easier to bear. Even more remarkable was Latoya's interaction with Timothy Wadsworth, a 12-year-old boy brought to the hospital for violent fits of madness. Timothy had been speaking in voices that weren't his own, recounting events he couldn't have known. When Latoya met him, something extraordinary happened. His erratic behavior immediately stabilized, and they conversed in the same unknown language. Dr. Aldrich, observing secretly, noted that both seemed to speak with knowledge beyond their years and experiences. The boy spoke of events long before his time, hidden graves, conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples, and long-forgotten family secrets, as if they were personal memories. When the session ended, Timothy returned to his normal state with no memory of their conversation. His fits ceased entirely, and within a week, he was sent home fully recovered. The ministers saw this as divine intervention, but Dr. Aldrich struggled to find a scientific explanation. The case became even more complex when Dr. Brennan discovered a troubling connection in the Salem Historical Society's archives. Dr. Brennan's discovery of a collection of letters from Reverend Josiah Mata, dated 1826, added a new layer of complexity to Latoya's case. The letters described a young woman living in the woods outside Millbrook, who the Reverend had attempted to civilize and Christianize. The Reverend's letters painted a picture of a woman who spoke in tongues and possessed knowledge that predated biblical accounts, claiming to remember events as lived experiences rather than learned tales. The letters revealed that she had deep knowledge of her people's suffering and healing practices that seemed to defy Christian understanding. Reverend Mata expressed fear in his final letter, written in 1829, stating he could no longer continue his efforts to save her soul. He had glimpsed truths about human suffering that challenged his faith and felt that he had encountered something beyond mortal comprehension. This discovery raised new questions about Latoya's identity and origins. The timeline aligned perfectly with her disappearance from the Presbyterian family, suggesting that her story stretched over 2 decades. As this information spread through the hospital, more staff members began reporting strange experiences. Nurse Margaret Thornton described vivid dreams about Millbrook's history, including details of the town's founding that she had never learned. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the oldest physician, started hearing voices from deceased patients as if speaking through Latoya's presence. These unsettling occurrences created an atmosphere of unease, dividing the staff into 2 groups, those who avoided Latoya's wing and those who felt compelled to spend more time there, claiming they were more attuned to their patients' needs. The tension affected the hospital's operations, and Dr. Aldrich found himself struggling with his medical objectivity. He had begun recalling forgotten details from his own childhood and gaining an intuitive understanding of his patients' conditions. He feared he was losing his scientific detachment writing in his journal. Latoya's presence has awakened something within me that I cannot name. It makes me a more effective healer, but it also makes me question everything about human consciousness. The situation reached a critical point when Mrs. Hitchcock, the pneumonia patient who had requested to be moved near Latoya, made a revelation that changed everything. On what she believed would be her final night, she whispered urgently to Dr. Aldrich, claiming that Latoya had shown her more than just memories of her late husband. "She's shown me things about this town, about this hospital's secrets buried here, that people have died to protect," Mrs. Hitchcock said. "I think she knows where they're hidden." This revelation sent shockwaves through the hospital. Dr. Aldrich immediately arranged a private meeting with Mrs. Hitchcock, insisting Reverend Whitmore be present for spiritual guidance. The discovery promised to unravel even deeper mysteries, pushing the hospital and its staff to the brink of understanding something far beyond their grasp. What Dr. Aldrich and the others learned on that fateful February evening would forever change their understanding of Latoya's case and the dark history of Millbrook. Mrs. Hitchcock, her breathing labored but voice steady, revealed, "She doesn't just remember the past. She carries it like a burden. She showed me things about this town that happened before any of us were born." Latoya had revealed the shocking truth about the land the Blessed Mercy Infirmary was built on. It once served as a sacred burial ground for the indigenous Pinnock people. Tribal elders had performed ceremonies there, not only for their ancestors, but also to honor the spirits of enslaved people brought to Massachusetts in the colony's early days. Latoya said the bones beneath this hospital's foundation were not just native bones. Mrs. Hitchcock continued, her voice trembling. They were the remains of those who died in chains, who were buried without Christian rites, forgotten by history. Their spirits have been calling out for justice, for someone to remember them. Dr. Aldridge felt an icy chill run down his spine. The hospital's construction records from 1834 mentioned the discovery of irregular burial remains during excavation, but Reverend Whitmore had ordered them to be quietly moved. Mrs. Hitchcock's words confirmed what Dr. Aldridge had suspected for some time. But there was more. Mrs. Hitchcock whispered, "She told me about Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood, Reverend Blackwood's father, who worked here in the early days. He was experimenting on patients, runaway slaves, native captives, immigrants without families. He called it studying the primitive mind." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. He kept detailed records. Dr. Aldridge's stomach sank as the implications hit him. The hospital had been built on both literal and metaphorical graves, and its early years had been marked by horrific medical practices violating Christian principles. Dr. Aldridge knew he had to investigate these claims, though he understood the cost could be the destruction of the hospital and his career. Over the next few days, he began searching through the hospital's oldest records stored in the basement archives. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden among routine reports, he uncovered a collection of journals, leather-bound volumes with the name Dr. N. Blackwood on the spines. The journals detailed experiments that even by 1847, standards were horrifying. Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood had conducted unauthorized medical experiments on vulnerable patients, many of whom were brought to the hospital against their will. The journals revealed Dr. Blackwood's obsession with mapping racial characteristics of pain responses and his experiments to test human endurance. He studied how different ethnic groups reacted to psychological torture, and he specifically sought out patients with spiritual abilities or cultural knowledge that differed from Christian traditions. One entry read, "These individuals, primarily of African or native origin, exhibit heightened sensitivity to stimuli that do not affect Christian patients. By subjecting them to controlled conditions of stress, I hope to isolate the source of their unnatural abilities and determine whether such traits can be eliminated through proper medical intervention." Dr. Blackwood's most disturbing interest was in patients who spoke in unknown languages or displayed knowledge of events they couldn't have possibly witnessed. His treatments included physical restraint, sensory deprivation, and spiritual realignment methods designed to break the connection between patients and their cultural memories. The final entry, dated November 15, 1838, described the young woman from the woods who had proven resistant to all conventional treatments. The journals suggested that Dr. Blackwood had been particularly obsessed with her, seeing her as the ultimate challenge to his theories of civilizing the so-called primitive mind. Dr. Aldridge's discovery confirmed the depth of the dark history underlying the hospital's foundation and the true nature of Latoya's presence. As the revelations unfolded, he found himself at the heart of a mystery that transcended the bounds of science, faith, and morality. Latoya's ability to access memories spanning generations only grew stronger despite the hospital's interventions. Dr. Aldridge concluded that she represented a form of human development incompatible with Christian civilization. For the safety of the community, he recommended her permanent confinement to prevent the spread of her influence. Dr. Aldridge realized with growing horror that Dr. Blackwood's young woman from the woods could only be Latoya herself. The timeline aligned with Reverend Mather's letters and the period after her disappearance from the Presbyterian family. She had been captured, brought to the hospital, and subjected to procedures designed to strip her of her identity and abilities. However, the journals revealed something else. Dr. Blackwood had failed. His final entries described growing problems within the hospital staff members, reporting disturbing dreams, visions, and a sense that the building itself had become contaminated by heathen influence. Dr. Blackwood had died suddenly in December 1838, reportedly from a heart attack, but his private notes suggested severe psychological disturbances in the weeks before his death. The boundaries between past and present have begun to blur. One entry read, "I find myself remembering things that happened to my patients as if they were my own experiences. I dream of chains whips children torn from their mothers of ceremonies in languages I do not understand. I fear that in my attempts to eliminate her unnatural abilities, I have somehow become infected by them." Dr. Aldridge shared these findings with Reverend Whitmore, who was forced to confront the horrifying truth about the hospital's history. Though he had known of the burial ground and approved the removal of remains, he was unaware of Dr. Blackwood's experiments. The revelation that the hospital had been built on a foundation of suffering and had participated in the torture of vulnerable patients shattered his faith in his own mission. "We must make this right," Reverend Whitmore declared, his voice heavy with guilt. "If this young woman has indeed carried the weight of these injustices for nearly a decade, we have a Christian duty to acknowledge it and seek redemption." However, as they prepared to confront Latoya, the hospital began experiencing a series of disturbing events that suggested the situation was more complex than they imagined. Patients throughout the building reported shared dreams, visions of historical events linked to the hospital's dark past. Staff members experienced memories that weren't their own, and the building seemed to respond to the growing awareness of its hidden history. Doors opened and closed inexplicably, and the temperature in Latoya's wing fluctuated wildly despite the cold season. Several staff members heard voices speaking in languages they couldn't identify. Dr. Aldridge began to realize that Latoya's presence had awakened something long dormant, the accumulated spiritual weight of those who had suffered and died on the hospital grounds. The crisis reached its peak when Reverend Blackwood, struggling with his family's connection to the hospital's history, approached Dr. Aldridge with a confession that would change everything. "I need to tell you something about my father," Reverend Blackwood said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Something I've kept hidden for nearly 30 years. He didn't die of a heart attack. He took his own life, but not before telling me about the young woman he had been treating. She showed him things about our family's past that he couldn't bear to live with. She made him remember the sins of our ancestors, and he could no longer face the weight of that knowledge." The revelation that Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood had committed suicide after being confronted with the full scope of his family's participation in slavery and genocide added another layer of complexity to the case. It suggested that Latoya's ability to access ancestral memories extended far beyond her own heritage. She could access the memories of anyone who came into contact with her. As the hospital staff struggled to process these revelations, they realized they were not dealing with a simple mental health crisis. Instead, they were confronting something far larger, an ancient force that could transcend time, history, and even identity itself. Latoya had become a living connection to the suppressed history of the community, a vessel of memories, not just of suffering, but also of guilt. Her presence had awakened the accumulated spiritual debt of generations, forcing everyone connected to the hospital to confront the true cost of their ancestors' actions. As Dr. Aldridge prepared for the final confrontation with Latoya, the question that haunted him was whether acknowledging this painful history would lead to healing or destruction. Latoya had already shown her ability to impact the mental and physical health of those around her. But what would happen when she was given the opportunity to share the full truth about what she had witnessed? On the morning of February 20th, 1847, Dr. Aldridge made a decision that would define the remainder of his career and alter the lives of everyone at the Blessed Mercy Infirmary. He gathered the hospital's senior staff, the 3 ministers, and a select group of stable patients in the main chapel. There he announced his intention to allow Latoya to speak freely about her experiences for the first time since her arrival. "We have spent weeks trying to understand this young woman's condition through the lens of medical science and Christian doctrine," Dr. Aldridge addressed the group. "But I believe we have been asking the wrong questions. Instead of trying to cure her or contain her, we need to listen to what she has been trying to tell us about the history of this place and the people who have suffered here." Latoya entered the chapel wearing a simple white dress. But as she moved toward the center, her demeanor had transformed. She carried herself with confidence and dignity, exuding an inner strength that seemed to emanate from deep within her. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed centuries of human suffering and resilience. "I am not one person," Latoya began, her voice clear and precise. "I am the keeper of memories that others have chosen to forget. I carry within me the voices of those who died without being heard, the stories of those erased from your history books, the pain of those who suffered in silence. What you call my condition, I call my purpose." As Latoya moved to the center of the chapel, the temperature seemed to shift. The room became both warmer and cooler, simultaneously, as if different seasons were occupying the same space. Several in the audience gasped, feeling what they later described as the presence of invisible figures standing alongside her, filling the chapel with spirits that had been waiting decades to be acknowledged. "This building stands on sacred ground," Latoya continued, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that resonated in the very walls. "Before your ancestors built your hospital here, my people and I claim kinship with all who have suffered, gathered in this place to honor the dead and heal the living. The Pennacook buried their sacred ones here, and later the bodies of enslaved people were hidden in this earth when their masters denied them proper burial." Dr. Aldridge's skepticism began to crumble as he watched the impact of her words on the crowd. Patients who had been struggling with various ailments began sitting straighter, breathing more easily as if some weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Staff members who had experienced strange dreams and visions nodded in recognition as Latoya described experiences that mirrored their own. "When Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood brought me here in 1838, Latoya continued, her eyes locking with Reverend Blackwood. "He believed he could sever the bond between my spirit and the ancestors who speak through me. He used instruments and techniques designed to destroy the connection. But suffering only deepened my ability to hold their stories. Every moment of pain he inflicted added another voice to the chorus I carry within me." The revelation that Latoya had been imprisoned at the hospital and subjected to brutal experiments designed to erase her cultural identity sent shockwaves through the audience. Several staff members began to weep, realizing they were working in an institution built on such systematic cruelty. Latoya turned her gaze directly to Reverend Blackwood and said, "Your father was one of the architects of my suffering." The weight of her words lingered in the chapel as the full scope of the hospital's dark past came into focus for everyone present. Latoya had not only been a prisoner in the hospital, but also a living testament to the atrocities hidden beneath its walls, atrocities that would no longer be ignored. Latoya's words echoed in the chapel, bringing both clarity and an unsettling sense of finality. "The memories I carry are not just of my own people's suffering, but of the pain inflicted by all who came before us," she explained. "When he looked into my eyes during our last session, he saw not just the anguish of his victims, but the spiritual torment that comes from participating in such evil. He could not live with that knowledge." Reverend Blackwood, visibly shaken, stood up, his legs unsteady, tears streaming down his face. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How can we make amends for what has been done?" Latoya's expression softened, and for the first time since her arrival, she smiled. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward healing," she said gently. "But true redemption requires action. The spirits that gather in this place are not seeking revenge. They are seeking recognition, remembrance, and a commitment that such suffering will not be forgotten or repeated." She moved toward the altar where Reverend Whitmore conducted his weekly services, and as she did, something extraordinary began to happen. The patients in the chapel started to speak, but not in their own voices. Mrs. Hitchcock, who had formed a deep connection with Latoya, began to recite names, dozens of names of people who had been buried on the hospital grounds without markers or recognition. Young Timothy Wadsworth, the boy once thought to be possessed, stood up and began to describe in perfect detail the layout of the original Pennock burial ground, including the location of ceremonial artifacts disturbed during the hospital's construction. Other patients, speaking in voices that seemed to come from beyond themselves, shared stories of families torn apart by slavery, of children who died in captivity, of rituals and traditions forbidden and forgotten. Dr. Aldridge realized he was witnessing something that defied medical and religious understanding. These patients were not exhibiting symptoms of mental illness. They were serving as conduits for historical testimony that had been suppressed for generations. Latoya had created a space where the dead could finally speak through the living. "The healing you practice in this building," Latoya said, addressing the medical staff, "cannot be complete while it rests on a foundation of unacknowledged suffering. Every patient who enters here carries not only their own pain, but the inherited trauma of their ancestors. Until you recognize this truth, your treatments will only address the surface of human anguish." Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the hospital's oldest physician, stood up shakily and walked toward Latoya. "I've practiced medicine for 40 years, he said, his voice filled with awe. "I've seen patients recover from ailments that should have killed them. And I've watched others die from conditions that seemed minor. I never understood why some people seem to carry burdens far greater than their individual circumstances could explain. You're telling us that healing requires addressing not just physical symptoms, but generational wounds." "Yes," Latoya replied. "And it requires understanding that the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, are not as fixed as your science pretends. The ancestors live within us, and their unresolved pain becomes our pain. Their unfinished business becomes our burden. Only by honoring their stories and learning from their experiences can we hope to heal ourselves and our communities." Sister Mary Catherine, who had been quietly observing from the back, stepped forward. "In my faith tradition, we believe in the communion of saints, that the dead remain connected to the living through divine love. What you're describing sounds like a more complex version of that same truth. The spirits that speak through you aren't separate from us. They're part of the ongoing human story." Latoya nodded approvingly. "Your understanding brings us closer to the truth. But this connection comes with responsibility. Those who carry ancestral memories, as I do, serve as bridges between worlds. We help the living understand the cost of forgetting, and we help the dead find peace through remembrance." The energy in the chapel was palpable. Dr. Aldridge noticed the light filtering through the windows seemed brighter, the air fresher, and the usual background noise of hospital activity had faded to an eerie silence. It was as if the very atmosphere had shifted in response to the unfolding revelation. Just when they thought they'd seen it all, the horror in Millbrook intensified. Dr. Aldridge asked, his voice heavy with anticipation, "What will happen to you now, Latoya?" "My work here is nearly complete," she replied. "The stories have been told, the acknowledgement has been given, and the commitment to change has been made. The spirits who have been waiting for recognition can begin to find peace, but the responsibility now passes to all of you." With those words, she reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew the brass locket, the only possession she had when she first arrived. The object that had been both a symbol of her suffering and a key to unlocking the past. She held it up for all to see, and the room fell into a profound silence. In that moment, the weight of history was undeniable. Opening the locket revealed not a portrait or keepsake, but a small amount of earth soil taken from every sacred site where Latoya's people had been buried or forgotten. This contains the essence of all the places where suffering was transformed into wisdom, she explained, placing the locket on the altar. As long as this remains here in a place of honor, the hospital will remember its true purpose, not just to heal individual bodies, but to address the wounds that span generations. Dr. Aldridge felt tears running down his cheeks as the full scope of what had transpired dawned on him. Latoya wasn't merely a patient with an unusual mental condition. She was a living repository of historical trauma, carrying the burden of collective memory, waiting for the right moment and the right people to help her share that load. "Will we see you again?" Dr. Aldridge asked, his voice heavy with the weight of her words, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Latoya smiled a sad yet hopeful expression. "You will see me in every patient who carries pain they cannot explain. In every family struggling with inherited trauma, in every community trying to heal from historical wounds. The work I do continues through others who are willing to listen to the voices that speak from the past." As she finished speaking, something remarkable happened. The patients who had served as conduits for ancestral voices began to return to their normal states. Yet they retained clear memories of what they had experienced. More importantly, they reported feeling lighter, as if burdens they hadn't known they were carrying had been lifted from their shoulders. Mrs. Hitchcock later described the experience as the most profound spiritual encounter of my life. After serving as a voice for the unnamed dead, she felt a deeper connection not only to her deceased husband, but to the entire human community. Her pneumonia symptoms, which had resisted all medical treatment, disappeared completely within days of the chapel gathering. Young Timothy Wadsworth's parents reported that their son's episodes of madness never returned. But he retained an unusual sensitivity to historical sites and an ability to comfort others experiencing grief or trauma. Dr. Aldridge would later write that the boy seemed to have inherited a portion of Latoya's gift for bridging the living and the dead. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in Dr. Aldridge himself. The experience in the chapel had fundamentally altered his understanding of medicine healing and the nature of human consciousness. He began to develop treatment approaches that addressed not only physical symptoms, but also the psychological and spiritual dimensions of illness methods that would later influence the development of what would become known as holistic medicine. In the days following the chapel gathering, the Blessed Mercy Infirmary underwent a transformation that amazed both staff and patients. The building itself seemed to breathe more easily, as if a weight that had pressed down on it for decades had finally been lifted. Patients recovered more quickly. Staff worked with renewed purpose, and the tension that had plagued the hospital for weeks gave way to an atmosphere of peace and healing. Dr. Aldridge spent long hours documenting everything that had occurred, creating a detailed record that would serve as both a medical case study and a historical testimony. However, he soon realized that the political and religious climate of 1847 Massachusetts was not ready to accept the implications of what had transpired at the hospital. Within a week of the chapel gathering, Reverend Whitmore received visits from several prominent community leaders, including the mayor of Millbrook and representatives from the Massachusetts Medical Society. Rumors of unusual practices at the hospital had spread. And now the authorities demanded explanations for the reports of patients speaking in unknown languages and claims about the building's history. "We cannot allow this institution to become associated with heathen practices or spiritualist nonsense," Mayor Harrison Blackwell declared during an emergency meeting with the hospital's leadership. "The reputation of our community depends on maintaining proper Christian standards in all our civic institutions." Dr. Aldridge found himself in an impossible position. The evidence of what had occurred was undeniable. Patients had recovered from conditions that had resisted all conventional treatments, and the hospital's overall functioning had improved dramatically. Yet, he could not explain these improvements without acknowledging phenomena that challenged both medical orthodoxy and religious doctrine. The political pressure intensified when several family members of former patients began asking uncomfortable questions about their loved ones' treatments during the early years of the hospital's operation. Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood's journals revealed systematic abuse that could have resulted in criminal charges if the doctor were still alive. The current leadership faced the possibility of legal action and public scandal if the full truth about the hospital's history became widely known. It was Latoya herself who provided a solution to this dilemma. On the morning of February 28th, exactly 6 weeks after her arrival, she requested a private meeting with Dr. Aldridge. When he arrived at her room, he found her packing the few belongings she had acquired during her stay. "It's time for me to leave," she said simply. "My work here is finished, and my continued presence would only create problems for you and the hospital doctor." Dr. Aldridge protested, arguing that she still needed medical care and that the hospital owed her compensation for the suffering she had endured. But Latoya's response revealed the depth of her wisdom and understanding of the political realities they faced. "The healing that needed to happen has occurred," she explained. "The spirits have been acknowledged. The truth has been spoken, and those who are ready to hear it have received the message. Forcing others to accept what they're not prepared to understand would only create resistance and undo the progress that has been made." She handed him a letter she had written addressed to the hospital's board of directors. In the letter Latoya left behind, she formally released the institution from any responsibility for her care and requested that her medical records be sealed to protect the privacy of all involved. She included instructions for honoring the sacred nature of the burial ground beneath the hospital and recommended treatment approaches that addressed the psychological and spiritual dimensions of illness. Dr. Aldridge, feeling the weight of the moment, asked, "What will you do now?" though he suspected that Latoya's future was as mysterious as her past. "I will continue the work I have always done," she replied. "There are other places where the dead need to speak through the living, other communities that need to confront their hidden histories. The gift I carry is not mine alone. It belongs to all those who are willing to serve as bridges between worlds." On the morning of March 1st, 1847, Latoya simply disappeared. The night nurse reported that she had checked on her at midnight, finding her sleeping peacefully. When the morning shift arrived, Latoya's bed was empty, her few belongings were gone, and there was no sign of how she had left the building. The only trace of her presence was the brass locket still resting on the chapel altar, exactly where she had placed it. In the following months, Dr. Aldridge implemented the changes Latoya had recommended. He established new protocols for patient care that emphasized the importance of understanding each individual's family history and cultural background. He created support groups for patients dealing with what he termed inherited trauma, and developed treatment approaches that combined medical intervention with spiritual and psychological healing. Most significantly, he worked with Reverend Whitmore to create a memorial garden on the hospital grounds, dedicated to all those buried there without recognition. The garden included markers bearing the names that had been spoken during the chapel gathering, along with a central monument acknowledging the sacred nature of the land and the hospital's commitment to honoring all who had suffered there. These changes had a profound impact on the hospital's effectiveness. Patient outcomes improved dramatically. Staff turnover decreased, and the institution gained a reputation for providing care that addressed not just physical symptoms, but the deeper sources of human suffering. However, the true nature of these improvements was never publicly acknowledged. Dr. Aldridge's official reports described Latoya as a patient suffering from dissociative disorder, who responded well to therapeutic intervention. Her ability to affect other patients was attributed to the power of positive psychology and peer support in the healing process. The chapel gathering was recorded as a successful experiment in group therapy, demonstrating the value of allowing patients to share their experiences in a supportive environment. These sanitized accounts satisfied the hospital's critics and allowed the institution to continue its work without political interference. However, Dr. Aldridge maintained detailed private records of what had actually occurred, hoping that future generations would be better prepared to understand and accept the deeper truths about healing and human consciousness that Latoya had revealed. The three ministers who had witnessed the events struggled with their own interpretations of what they had experienced. Reverend Blackwood spent months researching his family's history and eventually established a fund to support the education of children from families affected by slavery. Reverend Marsh incorporated elements of what he had learned about inherited trauma into his sermons, helping his congregation understand how the sins of previous generations could affect contemporary families. Reverend Whitmore became an advocate for what he called integrative healing, arguing that true medicine must address the spiritual and psychological dimensions of human suffering. The patients who had participated in the chapel gathering carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Many reported that the event had fundamentally changed their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. They developed unusual sensitivity to others' pain and an ability to provide comfort to those dealing with grief or trauma. Some became informal healers in their communities, helping others process difficult family histories and inherited wounds. Dr. Aldridge continued to practice medicine for another 30 years. But his approach was forever changed by his encounters with Latoya. He became a pioneer in what would later be called holistic medicine, emphasizing the importance of treating patients as whole human beings rather than collections of symptoms. His methods influenced a generation of physicians who would go on to develop more comprehensive approaches to healing. Most remarkably, several of these doctors reported encountering patients who seemed to possess abilities similar to Latoya's individuals, who carried ancestral memories, who could sense the deeper sources of others' pain, and who seemed to serve as bridges between the living and the dead. These cases were rarely documented in official medical records, but they suggested that Latoya's gift was not unique, and that there were others carrying similar burdens and serving similar purposes. In 1877, 30 years after Latoya's disappearance, Dr. Aldridge received a letter from a colleague in Ohio, who described treating a young woman who matched Latoya's description and demonstrated identical abilities. Similar reports came from hospitals in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, always involving a woman of mixed ancestry who appeared to be in her 20s, who spoke in unknown languages, and who helped patients and staff confront difficult truths about their personal and collective histories. Dr. Aldridge began to suspect that Latoya was part of a larger phenomenon, a network of individuals who carried the responsibility for preserving and sharing suppressed memories. Whether they were all manifestations of the same consciousness or separate individuals with similar gifts remained a mystery that he would never solve. He spent his final years compiling his records and reflecting on the implications of what he had witnessed. In his final journal entry written just before his death in 1889, Dr. Aldridge offered his ultimate conclusion about the case that had defined his career. I have come to believe that what we witnessed in 1847 was not an anomaly, but a glimpse into the true nature of human consciousness and community. We are not separate individuals, but part of an interconnected web of experience that spans generations. Those like Latoya who can access this deeper level of connection serve a vital function. They help us remember what we have chosen, to forget, heal wounds that span centuries, and maintain the bonds that connect us to our ancestors and our descendants. Modern medicine focuses on treating individual symptoms, but true healing requires addressing the collective trauma that shapes our communities and our world. The brass locket remained on the chapel altar until the Blessed Mercy Infirmary was demolished in 1923 to make way for a modern medical facility. According to the demolition records, the locket was never found among the building's artifacts, leading some to speculate that it had been taken by someone who understood its significance. Others believe that it had simply returned to the earth from which it came, its purpose fulfilled. Today, the site where the Blessed Mercy Infirmary once stood is occupied by a small park. Few visitors know about the building's history or the extraordinary events that occurred there in 1847. However, those sensitive to such things report feeling an unusual sense of peace in the area, as if the land itself remembers the healing that took place and continues to offer comfort to those who need it. The story of Latoya's case raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the reality of ancestral memory, and whether some individuals serve as living bridges between past and present. Whether these phenomena have natural explanations that science has yet to discover, or whether they represent genuine contact with spiritual realms, remains a matter of personal interpretation. What cannot be disputed is the transformative effect Latoya's presence had on everyone who encountered her. The patients who met her, the staff who cared for her, and the community leaders who had to grapple with the implications of her revelations. All reported that the experience fundamentally changed their understanding of healing, human connection, and the importance of acknowledging difficult truths about the past. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrates that healing, whether individual or collective, requires more than treating surface symptoms. True recovery demands that we confront the deeper sources of pain, acknowledge the ways that historical trauma continues to affect present-day communities, and create spaces where suppressed voices can finally be heard and honored. The mystery of who Latoya truly was, how she acquired her extraordinary abilities, and where she went after leaving the hospital may never be solved. But her legacy lives on in the lives she touched, and the understanding she shared about the complex relationship between past and present individual suffering and collective healing, and the medical treatment of symptoms versus the deeper work of addressing the spiritual and psychological wounds that span generations. This disturbing case reminds us that some of history's most important lessons come not from those who held power, but from those who carried the burden of remembering what others chose to forget. In our modern world, where we often focus on moving forward and leaving the past behind, Latoya's story suggests that true progress requires looking backward as well, acknowledging the suffering that came before us, honoring those who have been forgotten, and recognizing that the dead continue to speak through the living in ways that science is only beginning to understand. What do you think about this disturbing case from 1847 Massachusetts? Do you believe that some people can truly carry ancestral memories? Or do you think there's a more conventional explanation for what the doctors witnessed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story has given you chills, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more dark mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about human consciousness and the hidden connections between past and present. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying stories are often those that force us to question the very nature of reality itself. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.